She watched him walk into a ballroom full of strangers, and she completely fell apart, not from sadness, not from grief, but because the boy standing under those lights had become someone she almost didn't recognize anymore. Terri Irwin has faced some of the hardest moments any person can go through, losing a husband, raising 2 children alone, and carrying the weight of a global legacy. But when she finally saw what her son Robert had quietly become, something broke wide open inside her, and it wasn't the transformation anyone expected. The boy nobody fully watched grow up. Most people think they know Robert Irwin. They picture the little kid with the oversized grin trailing behind Steve Irwin on a wildlife set, wrangling something that probably had teeth. That image stuck. And for a long time, the public was perfectly fine letting it stay that way. But while the world stayed busy mourning Steve and celebrating Bindi's rise, something was quietly unfolding with Robert that almost nobody caught in real time. Robert Clarence Irwin was born on the 1st of December, 2003, in Queensland, Australia, the youngest child of Steve and Terri Irwin. He was barely 2 years old when his father was killed by a stingray at Bat Reef, near Port Douglas, in September of 2006. 2 years old. He has no real memory of the man the world called the Crocodile Hunter. He only knows his father through footage, through the stories Terri tells, and through the way people's expressions shift when they realize who he is. That is a specific kind of grief, the kind where you mourn someone you barely got to meet. And for years, nobody talked much about what that was actually doing to Robert underneath the surface. The cameras caught his smile. They caught his enthusiasm with animals. What they didn't catch, at least not back then, was a boy quietly carrying something enormous, growing up in the shadow of a legend he had no real personal memory of. Terri has spoken about those early years in fragments across various interviews, always careful, always protective of her kids. She described a season after Steve's death where she felt completely lost, where she had to learn how to run a zoo, raise 2 children in the public eye, and somehow keep functioning for the world. But she also made it clear that from the very beginning, Robert wasn't just coming along for the ride. There was something in him, even as a toddler, that both unsettled and amazed her. He didn't just observe animals. He interacted with them the way Steve did, without fear, without hesitation, with what looked less like bravery and more like complete natural ease. By the time Robert was 4 years old, he was already making television appearances alongside his mother and sister, and audiences quickly picked up on what Terri had been watching privately for years. This wasn't a kid performing for a camera. This was something else entirely, something that ran deeper than training or mimicry. And as the years moved forward, that something only became harder to explain away. The moment everyone started looking again. There is a strange thing that happens when someone grows up in public. People stop seeing them change. They keep looking at an old version long after it disappears. That is exactly what happened with Robert Irwin. Through his teenage years, he continued working at Australia Zoo, appearing on television, photographing wildlife, rescuing injured animals, and representing conservation projects around the world. But somewhere along the way, the little boy people remembered quietly became a young man. The change was gradual enough that almost nobody noticed until it was impossible to ignore. Then, almost overnight, headlines everywhere began talking about Robert for reasons that had nothing to do with crocodiles. Magazine covers, fashion campaigns, television appearances, charity galas, and international interviews suddenly placed him in front of audiences who had not seen him since he was a child. The transformation shocked millions because it seemed to happen all at once, even though his family had been watching it unfold every single day. For Terri, however, the attention created mixed emotions. She understood why people were fascinated, but to her he was still the little boy she had protected after Steve's death. She admitted in interviews that watching Robert step confidently into adulthood filled her with enormous pride, while also reminding her just how much time had passed. Every milestone her son reached carried 2 emotions at once. There was excitement for the future, but also the quiet realization that Steve was not standing beside them to witness it. Robert himself has often explained that growing older without his father created an unusual experience. Instead of remembering Steve directly, he has gradually discovered him through old videos, family stories, photographs, and the countless strangers who approach him to describe the impact Steve had on their lives. Every conversation adds another small piece to a relationship he never truly had the chance to build. Rather than feeling pressured by those comparisons, Robert eventually embraced them. He stopped trying to avoid becoming like his father because he realized the similarities were genuine. The compassion toward wildlife, the excitement around conservation, the energy in front of crowd, and even humor all seemed to emerge naturally rather than through imitation. People who spent time around the family frequently commented that Robert reminded them of Steve in ways that could not easily be explained. The night everything changed for Terri. Years after Steve's passing, Robert stepped onto one of the biggest stages of his life, surrounded by bright lights and thousands of spectators. For everyone else, it looked like another television appearance. For Terri, it became something far more personal. As she watched her son carry himself with confidence, kindness, humor, and complete ease in front of a massive audience, the weight of everything that had survived suddenly came rushing back. This was no longer the frightened little boy who had lost his father at 2 years old. This was a grown man building his own identity while still honoring the legacy he inherited. Friends close to the family later described how emotional the moment became for Terri because she realized Robert no longer needed protecting in the way he once had. He had become someone capable of protecting others, just as Steve always had. That realization brought overwhelming pride, but it also reopened years of grief that had never completely disappeared. Robert has repeatedly credited his mother for making that transformation possible. He has said that after Steve's death, Terri somehow found the strength to keep Australia Zoo running, continue conservation work across the world, and give both of her children the stable upbringing they desperately needed. Every achievement he celebrates today, he says, belongs as much to his mother as it does to him. Looking back now, it becomes easy to understand why Terri became so emotional watching Robert step into the spotlight. She was not simply seeing her son succeed. She was seeing the promise Steve never had the chance to witness fulfilled right in front of her eyes. In that single moment, the frightened widow from 2006, the exhausted mother trying to hold her family together, and the proud parent watching her son become his own man all seemed to exist at once. It was a transformation that had taken nearly 20 years to complete, and when Terri finally saw it with complete clarity, the emotions were simply too powerful to hold back. The legacy that refused to fade. As Robert continued stepping into larger public roles, one thing became impossible to ignore. Every appearance reminded people not only of who he was, but also of where he had come from. Whether he was rescuing wildlife, photographing endangered species, speaking about conservation, or representing Australia Zoo on the world stage, audiences consistently found themselves seeing echoes of Steve Irwin. Yet Robert never tried to become a replacement for his father. Instead, he focused on carrying forward the mission Steve had dedicated his life to protecting. Terri often explained that the greatest tribute her children could ever give their father was simply to live with kindness, compassion, and a commitment to conservation. That philosophy became the foundation of everything Robert pursued. Behind every television appearance, every public speech, and every conservation project stood years of quiet work that most people never witnessed. While headlines celebrated his growing popularity, Robert remained deeply involved in the daily operations of Australia Zoo, helping care for hundreds of animals while supporting breeding programs, wildlife rescue efforts, and environmental education. Those closest to the family often remarked that despite the growing fame surrounding him, Robert remained remarkably grounded. He continued approaching visitors with genuine warmth, treating every encounter as an opportunity to inspire someone else to care about wildlife. In many ways, the values Steve had championed decades earlier continued reaching new generations through Robert, not because he was trying to imitate his father, but because those values had become a natural part of who he was. Watching that quiet continuation of Steve's life's work became one of Terri's greatest sources of comfort. Every achievement reminded her that although Steve's life had ended far too soon, the purpose he believed in had never disappeared. It simply continued through the family he left behind, the win, the injury, and what Terri understood after. By the time the season 34 finale arrived on the 25th of November, 2025, something had shifted in the broader conversation about Robert Irwin. He had stopped being the crocodile hunter's son, who was doing well on a reality show. He had become the story. The stakes in the finale were already high. What made them higher was what came out in the days beforehand. Robert had been dancing through a significant injury. A strain in his intercostal muscles, the tissue between the ribs, had been causing him serious pain for weeks. His partner had mentioned it in a pre-finale interview, describing how the production team had quietly adjusted portions of the choreography to compensate, and how Robert had simply decided to push through without making a headline. When asked about it directly, Robert acknowledged the pain but framed it the way he frames most things, not as a sacrifice, but as a choice he made because the alternative wasn't something he was willing to consider. That small detail said something. It said something about how he was raised, about what it looks like when someone has grown up watching their mother absorb more than she should have to and keep going anyway, not for an audience, but because the work required it. On the night of the finale, Robert and his partner delivered 3 routines. The energy in the room built through each one. Their final freestyle drew a standing ovation before the scores were even announced, with one judge calling it a near-perfect performance and meaning it without hyperbole. The vote totals from that night represented one of the most engaged finales the show had seen in several seasons. Tens of millions of votes cast in a single evening. When the winner was announced, Robert Irwin was named the season 34 champion, joining his sister Bindi in the winner's circle exactly a decade after her own victory on the same show. The symmetry was not lost on anyone in that room. Certainly not on Terri. In the days that followed the win, Robert gave a television interview that became one of the most circulated moments from that entire period. He spoke about his mother with an emotional honesty that clearly caught the interviewer off guard. He described what Terri had done after Steve died, keeping the Australia Zoo running, raising 2 children under constant public scrutiny, maintaining a conservation mission while personally devastated, and said he got emotional just thinking about what it had actually cost her. He said she was extraordinary. He said the world had underestimated her from the beginning, and the fact that he knew that he had been watching and understanding over all those years was arguably the most significant thing about who Robert Irwin had become. Not the trophy, not the photography awards, not the television appearances. The awareness, the gratitude, the recognition of what it took. Terri, watching him say all of that, understood something she perhaps hadn't let herself fully believe until that moment. She had done it. Not just kept the legacy alive, not just held the family together. She had raised someone who could see clearly, feel deeply, and carry all of it forward without collapsing under its weight. That, more than anything else that had happened in those weeks, was what the tears were really about. Steve Irwin once said, in footage Robert has since watched and described as emotional to hear, that his ultimate goal was to one day be able to step back and let the next generation take the mission forward. That the moment he could do that would be the moment he knew he had actually succeeded at what he set out to do. He never got to have that moment. He was 44 years old when he died, and Robert was 2, and the mission landed on Terri instead, landing on her in the form of a zoo to run and 2 children to raise, and a world that was watching to see what came next. What came next was this: a 21-year-old standing in a ballroom holding a trophy, speaking about his mother with the kind of clear-eyed, earned gratitude that takes a lifetime to grow. A young man who had turned grief into purpose, pressure into identity, and a name that could have been a cage into something that looked, from the outside, like wings. Terri had kept the whole thing together long enough for this to happen, and now that it had, she could finally stop pretending it hadn't cost her anything. What do you think about this deeply moving story of Terri Irwin and her son? Share with us in the comments. Let's keep the conversation going. If this story was moving for you, smash that like button, subscribe for more untold Hollywood tales, and hit the bell so you never miss a drop. Want more? Check out another one of our videos, What Terri Sees Today. Looking at Robert now, Terri no longer sees only the little boy who lost his father. She sees a confident conservationist, photographer, television personality, and ambassador for wildlife who has earned respect in his own right. She has often spoken about how proud Steve would have been to watch both Robert and Bindi dedicate their lives to protecting animals and educating people about the natural world. Although Steve was never able to witness the adults his children would become, Terri believes his influence remains present in nearly every part of their lives. Robert himself has said that the greatest way he can honor his father is by continuing the conservation mission, rather than simply remembering it. Every crocodile demonstration, every rescued animal, Every educational presentation and every effort to protect endangered species represents another chapter in that legacy. For Terri, those moments are deeply emotional because they remind her of the promises she made after Steve's death to protect their family, preserve Australia's zoo, and ensure that Steve's passion for wildlife would never be forgotten. Nearly 2 decades later, she has watched those promises become reality. The little boy who once stood beside her searching for answers has grown into a man capable of inspiring millions of people around the world. That transformation is what finally overwhelmed her. It was never about fame or public attention. It was about realizing that despite unimaginable loss, the value Steve devoted his life to had survived through the next generation. And as Robert continues walking his own path, Terri knows the legacy her family built together remains stronger than ever, reaching new audiences while staying true to the purpose that first inspired the crocodile hunter all those years ago.